Broadcasting live from hell, this is The Monstrous Feminine, the podcast where horrible women talk about horror. My name is Louisa, and I'm joined by my coven,
Mila,
Taya,
and Zeba.
This week, we are going to delve into the history of black horror, or horror noire as coined by Dr. Robin R. Means Coleman. We're hitting pause on our breakdown of female horror tropes as listed by Barbara Creed. Although we love feminist horror and Professor Creed, we also feel that these discussions are often kept separate from conversations of race and horror. For this episode, we are covering all aspects of black representation, the good and the bad, so stay tuned!
To begin with, we will be discussing the era of Blaxploitation horror, starting with the legendary 1972 film Blacula, directed by William Crane. We will then talk about the polarizing 1992 film Candyman, directed by is it Bernard or Bernard?
I think it's Bernard.
Bernard, because he's English? Oh.
No, because I think it has an R after the E, and then another R after the A.
Well, I don't respect that man, so say his name however you want, and then people can.
Okay. I'm going again. I'm going to go for that sentence. We would then talk about the polarizing 1992 film Candyman, directed by Bernard Rose. Finally, we are going to wrap up by discussing the new era of black horror, as initiated by Jordan Peele's 2017 masterpiece, Get Out.
Hey guys.
Hey,
Since our last episode, the world has gone to shit, and we decided to make episode 3 dedicated to black horror, black representation in horror, black stories, black characters, because of the global Black Lives Matter movement and what's going on in the world, which sort of touches on many topics, but because we are a horror analysis podcast, we decided that this would be a good time to sort of tackle representation, racial representation in horror. So, how's everyone been since the last episode?
Pretty pissed, pretty angry, pretty fed up. Yeah, anyone else?
I went back to the U.S. because I was scared travel would be cut off or something insane like that. And honestly, kind of correct. Mainly because of Corona instead. It's been pretty terrible. But I feel like, to be honest, this isn't a new thing in the U.S. It's just because everyone is looking at it right now, it seems like this is worse than normal, but I think all of this goes on a regular basis and we just don't hear about it because it's not in the news cycle or on people's radar. So I guess in a way it's slightly better just because people know what's going on and it's not like innocent people are dying and we're not hearing about it as much, although that probably still is happening. But I mean, some of the cases that we're seeing coming up now that everyone's discussing are from last year or from months ago that people are bringing up now. So I think it's better that we're starting to see so many people demand justice and hopefully we see real change. And I think this episode is great. It's a fun way to talk about black art and not a way that feels like another extension of trauma porn.
That was really eloquent. You're so articulate and I'm just like, fuck America, fuck cops, I'm tired of this fucking shit. It's and then Taya's running a campaign over there. I'm like, oh, okay.
Got my vote.
Yeah, I'd vote for you.
Ophelia, call the police. Sure. Playing Fuck the Police by NWA.
Fuck the police coming straight from the underground. A young nigga got it bad 'cause I'm brown.
First up, we were talking about the 1972 cult classic Blacula, directed by William Crane. In this film, William Marshall plays Mamuwalde, an African prince who's been turned into a vampire by Dracula after failing to recruit Dracula to the side of slavery abolitionists. 2 centuries later, Mamuwalde, now Blacula, wakes up in a coffin and begins wreaking havoc on 1970s LA.
Almost 2 centuries ago, the ruling elders of my people sent me, yes, and my bride, to Europe on a mission to protest the slave trade.
The slave trade?
On that mission, I myself was enslaved, my wife murdered, and I was placed under the curse of the undead. Our assassin was the vampire Count Dracula.
Basically, you know how, in terms of iconic black voices, everyone says Morgan Freeman? I really think they missed an opportunity here, because I think William Marshall is actually you know, he should be the voice, you know, the voice of God. We really missed out there. And actually, his voice is so soothing that he could be like your grandpa, Taya, I feel. You both have the similarly lovely voices. Voice-wise.
Just voice-wise.
Just voice-wise.
None of his talent, just his voice.
I mean, I don't know. I've seen your acting ability, so...
I do not want to talk about my acting past from my forced film classes.
I feel like he was the Morgan Freeman of
his day,
in terms of people recognizing his voice and it being like a sort of universally loved voice. He probably was. Maybe not. I watched loads of interviews and people were like, "We loved your voice."
Oh, was it a thing? Like people have already made it a thing? Because I have not. The only thing that's trickled down to my ears is Morgan Freeman being the iconic voice, and I just think that that's a missed opportunity.
Blacula, Dracula's soul brother.
So how did you guys feel about the movie? I found it like a bit hard to watch because it was like kind of like the overall feeling of the movie was like sheer embarrassment, to be honest. But
see, here's the thing about Blaxploitation is like they are bad movies. I think we shouldn't be afraid to like say that, especially because the budgets that they had were just not on the level of other movies coming out in the 70s. They really had to fight for like production value. They really couldn't pay their actors that well, so they were relatively unknown actors. Like the writers were people who were not going to be in other writers' rooms, especially black writers or directors. So like fundamentally most of them are so cringy and so bad. And now looking back on them, I kind of like the camp of it all. Like, if you find ones with, like, Foxy Brown or those, like, good cop infiltrates XYZ movies, like, those can be fun now looking back on. Blacula has its, like, moments. I think the fashion is great. I think the music is great. I think the visuals are fun. But, like, most Blaxploitation movies are bad. And that's okay.
I think on, like, a scale of 0 to fucking camp, this movie wasn't even that camp. There wasn't so much of the, like in-your-face, campy fun as what I was expecting. There were, like, waves of camp, and then it was, like, almost serious, which I guess I expected, just from you guys talking about it, I expected something a lot more intense.
I don't know what you're talking about. I thought it was the most ridiculous thing. I would say it's full camp on the scale of 1 to fucking camp. I was like, what is this? It was everything I thought it would be from when my dad told me about it, and I Googled the movie poster, and I was like, that's a hate crime. And then I watched it, and I was like, indeed.
I think I'm watching, like, sickeningly camp movies, and I've been desensitized.
Maybe your camp scale's skewed, because I was like...
I am into musicals.
Oh, God. Ew.
Yeah.
Okay. That's a podcast review I'm not listening to. So should we talk about what horror looked like before Blacula? Because obviously Blacula was iconic because it was like, when we look back, we see it as the sort of first black horror that there was that initiated a whole bunch of other blaxploitation horror. But before this, Dr. Robin Armeens Coleman makes a distinction in her book Horror Noire about black horror, which is content horror created by black creatives and actors and filmmakers, and then blacks in horror. So before the sort of blaxploitation era, when we go back to just earlier, like in the 1900s, we have films like The Birth of the Nation in 1915, where we have black people in horror, but not really. It's just white people in blackface, and it's them portraying really horrible, derogatory stereotypes of black people to the end of glorifying the KKK and the Confederacy in America, and it's awful. So this is kind of, if you look back on it, this is kind of on the timeline of horror noir, because it's our first glimpse of black people being monstrous, but as they are the monsters. So it's kind of included in horror noir, even though it's not really black horror.
I would find Birth of a Nation really hard to consider, like, be a horror film, because it's just a straight up race propaganda film. That movie is not like horror in like traditional horror sense. It's like horrifying that people watched it.
Can we also talk about how after people stopped making classic blaxploitation movies, like, there's the stereotype of the black person's the first person to die in a horror movie, so they're not the monster anymore. They're not the thing that holds power. They're not the thing that we should be afraid of. It's like, if there is a black character in a horror movie that's made by white people, they will be the first person to die. And it's like a trope in the way that the final girl is a trope. Like, the black person is the first girl. And I don't really know why that is. I guess because they're like the most disposable actor or the most disposable character or the person that we don't need 2.5 hours to get to know. They're just, I think, like, violence against a black body is considered like the thing that happens before the real terror starts, if that makes sense.
When I was watching, I was like, it's strange that he would be the one to get punished for failing to get Dracula to be on the side of abolitionists instead of abolitionists. I mean, obviously black people were abolitionists at the time too, because they didn't want to be slaves, but I was like, what on earth? Like, that plot just shook me, and I was like, how would he be responsible for this himself?
Did you know that William Marshall added that bit in, like the actor who's playing Blacula? He added in this whole black story. Black story. I mean, back story. But you know what is a black story? Because he basically wanted this whole plot of, you know, I think I actually found this like interesting interview of him. So maybe insert clip.
Now, you actually convinced them to change the script, and as we saw in the movie, Blacula, before he became Blacula, was a prince from Africa.
Prince Mamuwalde was his name.
Was there much resistance at that time to do this?
Absolutely.
What did they say to you? What kinds of things were said to you?
Oh, I don't think that will work. We don't want to deal with the subject of slavery. I said, well, we didn't want to either. Had to.
It's true.
And I think that it hasn't been dealt with properly. This is a wonderful time to illustrate that there were African people who were concerned.
He was like, I want nothing to do with the construction of Blacula. Like, that's all your direction. I'm gonna try to introduce a character, inject some like Swahili and some African like ancestry into the movie, because he thought, you know, this is not going to be relatable to your target audience, which is black people. And if you just have a story with a black vampire, like, you're gonna need him to have a relatable and compelling backstory, which would be trying to fight slavery. So that's why there's kind of this random 5 minutes at the beginning. He was basically saying there would be no reason for him to attack other black people unless he was injected with Dracula's curse of racism. So the venom or virus or whatever you want to call vampirism condition is his own version of enslavement.
And they make Dracula makes a point when he's changing him. He's like injecting this sort of animal nature, this animalism into him, which he at the beginning like accuses Mamuwalde of, being like, oh, he says something like, oh, but you're from the jungle. And then Mamuwalde also accuses him of being like an animal because of his views of slavery as having merit.
Yeah.
When he said like injecting racism into him, he is kind of like cursing him with so many double ironies.
Yeah.
That bit about, you know, having bits of Swahili and like having a very particular, like, the African prince sort of narrative is so indicative of the time, because this was the moment in like Black history when people were like, African Americans specifically, really wanted to reclaim African roots and Pan-Africanism and didn't really know how to do it. I made a little note that this is early Hotep ideology, because he couldn't just be a regular black guy. He had to be royalty. He had to have this... all the girls are light-skinned, like, let's talk about it. Like, all the love interests are these light-skinned girls with these, like, cute little fros. You know, choosing Swahili words. Swahili is a Pan-African language that's, like, of the diaspora. It really is, like, indicative of that 72, 73 inability for African Americans to know what to claim. I think it was how a lot of people thought and how a lot of people still think, and I think that we've sort of gone beyond that and said, okay, we don't necessarily need to all be descended from African royalty. That is not historically accurate. But like, I think that's where that came from, and a lot of people would have found a lot of solace in that backstory.
Yeah, I think people did, because that's why it was like, it had mixed reviews at the time, but it was a huge hit because I think people really resonated with that. At least black audiences did.
I don't know. I feel like my mom said when she saw this movie when she was like younger, and like my grandma said as well, that they didn't like it and they found it incredibly problematic even at the time. I mean, I get the backstory and I do see what you guys are saying about it, but at the same time I'm like, it was like 5 minutes It was like a very short thing that just felt like it was thrown in there, and like the justification to attack your own people as well. Also, Zeba, how you mentioned all the women were light skinned. It was like, this movie has so many problems within it, which is obviously how Blaxploitation films are going to be. But I was like, what? Like, I find it hard to believe like anyone during that time was also like, this is it. This is the movie.
I think there are hoteps of today who would like it. Like I think the majority of people with sense would look at that and be like, that's ridiculous. But I absolutely like know folks who, you know, have that sort of mindset.
But don't you think that, I mean, obviously it's problematic, but we're going back to like a beginning portrayal. So like anytime you go back in time and look at Black representation, it's always fraught with contradictions, and like there's nothing that's solely empowering or something that's solely, well, no, there's loads of things that are solely negative, but you mean like even the empowering stuff is going to have lots of like nuances within it. But I think one thing it does well with that, potentially building on the time but clumsily inserted backstory, is that it does frame him as a more sympathetic victim, or a monster, but not like a clear-cut monster. Like, I think it works to frame him as somebody who's been a victim of Dracula's racism and been enslaved by him, and that's why he's, you know, biting other Black people, because he's continuing this curse of enslavement.
I think I'm having like the same problem with this as I have with Candyman, which is like, both of them basically endured violence by white people and was like, in return, I'm going to inflict pain upon my own people. And that to me is like very hard to comprehend. But yeah. I get like during these times, and even today, like a lot of Black writers and directors have a lot of issues with funding, and the studio kind of steers you where they want you to go. So I'm sure if they were like, I want a movie where he's like very pissed off about slavery and he was bit by Dracula and he decides as revenge to go kill white people, I'm sure that would not have flown at all. Obviously, no studio would have approved something like that at the time.
Yeah. I know one thing that academic author Tanana Reeve said was the one thing Blaxploitation era did was it let Black people tell a version of horror. Like, it gave them a voice that they didn't have before. It's not the best representation, but it's kind of like, well, at least there's some representation. There's definitely moments that I thought were somewhat empowering, like little digs, like they snuck little digs in there, like how he accuses the police officer of not caring about the Black victims or the Black murders. And when the police officer says, well, maybe it's the Panthers doing it, and he's like, no, the Panthers wouldn't do that. And so there's these very obvious like little signals in there where they're trying to make a more empowering narrative for Black audiences.
I think you touched on it, Ty, when you talked about like Hollywood producers and their power in determining how it ultimately comes out of the film. Even if you can sneak in like a few references, a line here and there, it's difficult to create a film that was like through and through radical.
It's a problem of like, you want the representation, but Black people can only get the representation if they're the monster. So what can you do within this framework? Okay, we're going to make a slightly more sympathetic monster with this enslavement backstory. So it's kind of like, but he's still the monster. So we're kind of operating within a limited framework here. Which is kind of dealing with the legacy from films like The Birth of the Nation, where that was showcasing Black monstrosity. So it's like slowly trying to move away from that. It's not doing the best job, but at least it's something. I wanted to ask you guys, what do you think of how he looks, Blacula, when he's like in full like attack mode? Because I read one interpretation, which was by, I think, Noel Carroll, Ethnicity, Race, and Monstrosity, an essay. And it was saying that this is tapping into a long-standing association of the Black person with the simian and monstrosity. But then I read another interpretation, and to be fair, I'm not very much convinced by the second one. But it was by Dale Hudson in an essay called Vampires of Color. They were saying that actually he's hairy like a Black Panther. But if that obviously to me was a reach. But he was saying that like any white victim he bit, because there were some white people that I think got bit.
The police officer.
Yeah, but it was like they were relegated to a more outskirts They were robbed of their privilege and also enslaved, so they were relegated to a more outcast existence. So in that way, he could be an empowering figure. But I was like, that interpretation doesn't really work if he's mostly biting black people, which he does. So, but I wondered what you guys thought of his like overly hairy, weird afro eyebrows.
This might be a shallow interpretation, but I was under the impression that vampires were supposed to be sexy. And if we go back to the original Dracula, the point of like the OG vampire narrative is that they're supposed to be seductive. And I think there is a lot of reclamation of black sexuality in this movie and a lot of Blaxploitation movies. I think people don't know how to reconcile what is considered white seduction and like traditional white sexiness with what a black vampire would look like. That's why the vampires in Twilight are ashy. We don't know how to make them pale. We don't know how to make them like appealing to women. We don't know why people would fall for them or fall into their trap if they're ugly. It doesn't make any sense. And so that thing of like he looks like a monkey, I didn't think about that. I don't want to think about that too hard. Honestly, I don't buy the Black Panther narrative at all. It was all very hard to buy, especially because that woman who looked like his wife, the one that he was seducing and fell in love with, sort of, it was implied that she was under some sort of hypnosis or some sort of vampire magic. But like the lore of vampires, especially women vampires, but Dracula in particular, is that they are sensual, that they're sexual, that they're seductive. So I was confused why this one like looked more like a werewolf.
Yeah, that's what one of the critics was saying. Like, there's literally no reason for him to look like a werewolf because it's just mixing lore, and it's like, why did they do that? Like, why did they choose to make him look like that? And I think you're right. It's like, how do you reconcile that he's supposed to be sexy if we're still operating in a world of limited portrayals of black sexuality? I think you're right on the money. The fact that he's reluctant too, like he knows that it's a curse and it's like a type of enslavement, so he deliberately does not want to bite her, but he wants to be with her in immortality. But literally, just like Twilight, like honestly, plagiarism, he waits for her to be dying to turn her.
Yeah.
So Stephenie Meyer basically is a confirmed Blacula fan. That's what I'm saying here.
I was about to say, are you suggesting that Mormon Stephenie Meyer is a fan of OG Blaxploitation films that says, let me make this the Purity Ring special?
Zeba, that's exactly what I'm trying to get across here.
I think they do that in like every vampire thing though, where like the girl wants to turn and he's like, no, you don't know how bad this life is. Oddly enough, like in werewolf movies, I feel like no one ever says, turn me into a werewolf.
Yeah. No one wants to be a dog.
You don't have to be one like all day. It's just a full moon. So that's like a more limited existence of being a monster. But no one ever wants to do that. They're like, no, keep that to yourself.
Vampires are hot.
Yeah, before Twilight, the werewolves, were not sexy. But then Twilight with all their spicy white people.
Okay, but the bestiality line is a thin one, and it's one that I would rather not cross.
But no, I also, this other critic, Harry Benshoff, in Blaxploitation horror films, generic reappropriation or reinscription, he was saying that the romanticization is like a deliberate political tactic to tap into as well, in that it blurs the line between monstrosity and sympathy. Like, I think it's more of a tragedy to watch him die at the end because he's so heartbroken, and it helps in his sort of martyrdom if he's like in love and he's like, well, you know what? I have no reason to continue this existence without my partner, so I'm gonna go. Like, I'm out. Because he could have just been like, whatever, I'm immortal. I'm going to keep enslaving other black people. Goodbye. But he's like, suicide.
It's humanizing.
I think this movie is like slightly better in empowerment simply because of the ending where he dies and it's like the martyrdom. It's like a return to humanity.
Around this era and then of filmmaking and then thereafter, there is so many black vampires. And I wanted to ask you guys, like, why do you think that is? Do you think the obvious answer of, like, blood mixing is a thing? Like, do you think this vampires of color thing is a crisis over multiculturalism? or a fear of like DNA and like eugenics and all that playing into that racial stereotype? Or do you think there's another reason that people were so obsessed with making black vampires?
I don't know. I feel like part of it is like vampires were like the go-to horror thing for like a significant period of time. And that was like the only thing people could really think of.
I think also like within the context of the 70s, in terms of filmmaking, like it was a decade in which directors were more like looking towards deconstructing genres. The other example I'm thinking of now isn't within horror, but like Blazing Saddles came out in 74, which inserted a black protagonist into the Western. I mean, it's a comedy, it's completely different. And I don't think it was necessarily with like always noble intentions, but I think it was more like from a filmmaking perspective, like, let's just turn everything on its head. And so it sort of caught on then.
I think there's also something to be said for just immortality as a concept for, like, black folks. It's the same concept as, like, Afrofuturism. It's like, imagine a world where we didn't die. Incredible. Can't even fathom it. Being the most powerful thing, the fact that, like, the cops can shoot right through you and you are still the most powerful thing. Like, I thought that scene towards the end in that fight when they think all I have to do is like pull out a gun and the situation is over is just like it's kind of nice to watch. To, you know, just be the most powerful thing in the room. It's something so rare for black folks in life and in film.
Next up, we are going to talk about the 1992 film Candyman, directed by Bernard Rose. In this film, a white graduate student named Helen investigates the local legend of Candyman at the Cabrini Green Project, Chicago. Candyman, played by Tony Todd, is the vengeful ghost of a lynched slave who appears and kills you if you say his name 5 times in the mirror.
Helen, I came for you.
So, who of the 4 of us has a crush on Candyman?
I would say 4 out of 4 of us should have a crush on Candyman. I'm not gonna say that I have. I'm not gonna say I've tried to summon him and have him hover above my form. But I think it's a universal attraction that everyone partakes in.
Like, if Yaya turns into Candyman in a new one, then I will indeed share this with you. But in the old version, it's going to be a no for me.
I was skeptical when Zeba said she spoke of her attraction, but then I watched the film and I'm on board.
I'm gonna say that I would not, but I think the actor is attractive. Tony Todd's attractive. And his voice as well. Another great voice. Be my victim. It's, you know.
Be my victim. Be my victim.
I just might.
Also his coat. Something about his whole look, it came together and I was like, yeah, okay, I'll be your victim.
His look is basically the Babadook, so...
Okay, I don't want to read into that, I really don't.
So, what are you saying?
Don't expose my psyche there.
Okay, sorry.
No, the coat is flames, the bees is next level accessory. All 2021, we're all gonna be rocking live bees.
Did you know he got $1,000 for each bee sting?
He got stung?
They were real bees?
So it was like a given that he'd get stung. And in his contract, for every sting, he'd get $1,000.
That's fucking hardcore. $1,000? What an actor, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
we call that method.
Method. So I guess the ultimate testament to your attraction at Zeba, at Mila, is would you play Candyman? Would you summon him?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it depends. It definitely depends on the circumstances and like how great my life was going at that point. But I feel like that's a risk I might be willing to make. I've played Bloody Mary, so I don't think it's much different.
That was gonna be my next question. Have y'all ever played like a Candyman equivalent like Bloody Mary? I have not.
No, I'm 100% like we don't do that.
I'm with you. I do not do that. I don't welcome any of that energy.
I feel like I've done all of that. I've done Bloody Mary. I've done the Ouija boards. Anything that welcomes
what the hell?
Anything that welcomes like spirits into my space, any sort of ancestor worship, I just want to see it. I just want to like push the boundary.
Can I just
you
say
just broke
that
exactly what I said about black people don't do that. Why?
I would be the first black person to die in this movie.
Should we talk about Bernard?
You talk about Bernard. I love that. I love how British people say Bernard.
Bernard Rose. What's his deal?
He doesn't know how to write about black men. That's his deal.
He only directed it. I think it was originally a play. Am I remembering this wrong?
No, you're right. It's a different white author, and then he's a white director. So he only directed. I misspoke, but
I think he helped adapt it to the screenplay, along with short story author, other white dude who I can't remember his name.
Good.
Good.
No, just kidding. This is not necessarily his direction. In actual fact, I think like the way the movie is shot and like how it is, it's like a good movie, like quality wise, in terms of thematic and the lack of reflection on how it could immensely backfire. I think the film's really good, very compelling, but the lack of policing on how they're portraying Tony Todd, that's the issue.
I agree. I think the movie is like very watchable. It's not like in the same way where you're like the entire time you watch Blacula, we're like, this is so unbelievable. But like this one, like you can watch it and you're pretty into the movie. It's just like the plot itself and the way that the actors are manipulated and the exploitation behind it is what's the problem. But the movie itself is like very watchable and it's entertaining.
I think I'm just thoroughly confused why white people even think up stories like this. Like, where did you even...
Oh, God, here we go. I wasn't ready for your launch into the slander. You're like, I'm confused why white people...
It's genuine. Like, where did you dream that up?
He, like, adapted it from this story that was based in Liverpool and was like, Chicago, race relations. It's like, wait, hold on. I don't think you're qualified to take that leap.
I think that it's... And if it was any black writer or who wrote this story, I find that they would have never had an ex-slave kill or what's the word? Like a ghost of a slave go and seek vengeance against other black people. Like, I don't know if that would have even crossed a black creator's mind to do that. So that's the whole, like, problem of the film. And the story in general of Candyman, like the whole legend is flawed from the offset because that's just so unbelievable.
And also, how different is it from, like, this might be a reach, but how different is it from the narrative that we tell in Birth of a Nation, where it's like white women have to be afraid of black men, black sexuality, miscegenation, race mixing. Like, it's not condemning those things, but it's still continuing a narrative that started, this continuing a narrative of, like, racial propaganda. And Helen's character is a lot to unpack that I don't think they did a lot of in the creative process.
I think, like, at this point, it's interesting that we have our Monstrous Feminine podcast, right? So we always focus on, like, we're our sole focus, or our main focus. A lot of our focus is women, and in this film we have not like in terms of like the eyes of like who's a sympathetic character, it obviously is supposed to be Helen, so we don't really have a monstrous feminine, but at the expense of Candyman being the monstrous figure. Like her whole like feminist trajectory and innocence is and her whole like final girl until thing is based on Candyman's portrayal and black monstrosity, basically. Like, why is it that with a black couple, even though Luva, the actress, is very light skinned, but she's black, but why is it with like a black couple, it's he doesn't have to be solely a monster, but like if it's a white woman, then he's a monster, you know what I mean?
I think there was such a like an attempted disconnect between her and like to some extent Bernadetta, her friend, them versus this like stuffy British white academic. But actually Helen is the same fucking thing, despite the fact she braves it and goes into the projects. Like she's still taking that story and using it to, and like take credit for it in like the sort of elitist world of academia.
I found her character very realistic. Like, I could so see a white woman academic doing this exact project and getting in people's business. And the scene that really got under my skin is when she's talking to that child. Like, she wants him, basically she's doing like an interview. Yo, the ethics are where? First of all, you can't interview anybody, you can't talk to anybody without an ethics form, period. But that is a child whose parent is not present. Like, that is such weird predatory behavior, huge red flag, and yet she's still the person we're supposed to empathize with.
I was thinking that scene when she was like, "You can trust me," and I'm like, why?
Why? You're coming in and, first of all, just trespassing in some random abandoned apartment like that you have no business being in. Also, like, was taking photographs of people's front doors and like, ooh, this is so like hood. I was like, what? Because she was just photographing graffiti that, honestly, at the beginning that she was taking pictures of had nothing to do with Candyman anyway. I was just like, what do you like, it's like, these are people's lives, have some respect. So she's definitely not without fault, but I think, like, yeah, she's meant to be our main hero, but it's kind of like,
I feel like we've seen Helen's character, like, several times throughout history, and please note, I am not comparing Candyman or Blackman to the other characters I'm mentioning, but, like, she's the exact same character that we see in Tarzan with Jane, and with, like, the female character in King Kong, where it's, like, this sympathetic, beautiful white woman goes into an environment and tries to help. And, like, they're doing the exact same thing, but somehow we're supposed to take it from a different lens and be like, oh, but it's fine because they're doing it. And, like, she doesn't mean any harm. She's just nice and innocent. Like, it's the exact same character, just repeated.
But, like, okay, what do you think of the role of myth, then, in Candyman? Because, like, what he gets his empowerment from, even if it's so, obviously it's warped and problematic, he appears when people dare to say his name, it's like they're doubting the myth, they're doubting his power. So he's like, his way of, it's warped, but his way of getting empowerment from his completely terrible, horrible lynching death is to reperpetrate the myth and try to get some power in like kind of reclaiming how that story is told. So that's why she becomes like his ultimate goal, because she's someone who's daring to challenge that myth, and he's almost like, he's taking that as like a kind of slight and undermining of his own power, because that's the only way he can have power.
There were definitely pieces of this film, particularly the folklore, the myth, the idea of, like, they even refer to the newspapers as like circulation of truth. There was like pieces of the film where I'm like, you could have made such a great point here about, like, again, back to the idea of like white academia, the way that black stories are told through white voices. You could have like really taken that and flipped on its head, especially with like also the religious imagery. There could have been so much about like grander narratives of religion and society, but then it, like, that warped sense of he feeds on it to survive, it kind of contradicts itself.
Yeah. And
there was no mention of the importance of oral history to black culture. Like, I'm sure there's so many, you know, quote unquote myths like the Candyman that exist in particular cities or neighborhoods or areas or cultures or traditions, and those things are taken seriously by black people because they represent a larger message or something to be wary of or something to remember, or they're a way of invoking history so that it's not forgotten, because, like, the tradition is just not to write it down. And you're right, there could have been a really integral, like, exploration of why white people feel the need to write it down and also feel the need to prove that it's not true, because the purpose of the story was not to just scare people. The purpose of it was like, let's remember this horrific thing that happened to a black person. Let's remember what happens when you get too close to white women. It was a warning, it was a message, and I, like, part of me wanted to believe that that's what the movie was doing and that people are, like, interpreting it wrong, because I don't want to, like, believe it was just completely overlooked.
But also, that article you sent, Zeba, about how problematic it is for, even in, like, nowadays with Black Lives Matter victims, the fact that it's also just horrible that he can only have power in death is what I thought was a really interesting article that you put to us, because separately in our private group chat, which is really exclusive, and but it was just I thought that was like interesting that even now we still have a narrative of like, you know, people only pay attention when they're already dead, like when it's already too late.
It's so easy to read like into this too much and to like spin it into something more progressive, but could that have been like the slant that his calls to people to remember him is like a play on that, or no?
Tanana Reeve when she interviewed Tony Todd, she said that he said that lots of black men in hindsight thought that it was kind of an empowering role. So we can't look at it as like, we're talking about it from a perspective of like bad representation or like problematic representation, but we can't ignore the fact that lots of people still liked this character. And I can kind of see why. I think maybe in the fact that yes, he doesn't really kill Helen, but it's almost like he does take revenge at the same time. Okay, there's two things going on. Like, for one thing, I really hate the sort of predatory black man stereotype, especially if we're talking about an interracial couple, because often the black person in that partnership is the person who's been fetishized. So it's not only just a complete stereotype and myth, but it's also somewhat inaccurate compared to reality. But so I hate that it does that as well as when it's trying to do this. But I also think that his idea of making her have to join him in the myth is kind of empowering in a way, because it's like, hey, I had to suffer the consequences of our relationship because he died because he was because of an interracial relationship between him as a slave and her as the slave master's daughter. But he's basically trying to make her reincarnated form suffer the same consequences he did. So in a way, it's kind of empowering, because it's like, you're going to have to suffer the same fate. So it's kind of like, yes, his revenge and vengeance is misplaced a lot. Like, he should just go after the slave owner's descendants, but he doesn't. But, like, in a limited way, I can see how that would have been, like, okay, this revenge narrative of, like, I'm going to make you have to be punished for our sexual deviancy back in the day now.
The thing that I struggle with is because she's under this hypnosis, whenever, like, the spirit of Candyman, like, causes her to do harm, there's no accountability for her actions, and it makes this narrative of if a white woman were to do a wrong, and she does plenty of wrong when she's not under hypnosis, like, let's be clear, but he's doing it on his own accord as like a revenge plot. But if she's doing something bad, it has nothing to do, she must be under the spell of a black person, or the lack of accountability, and the fact that she does all that and the police just book her. They don't shoot her, they don't kill her, they don't like brutalize her in any way. They just put her in handcuffs and she's able to escape. All the politics of like white womanhood are completely like dashed over, I think.
The ethics and consent that always goes with those stories where it's like a slave is dating their master and the master's son or something, because you can't consent to a relationship in which someone owns you. And so like he's being held accountable in a way for a relationship where he's basically being manipulated into the relationship and has no real consent and agency within the relationship, because even if he at any point wanted to discontinue it, could he discontinue a relationship in which she is the master's daughter?
But I guess that's kind of why it's, I guess, somewhat satisfying that she's being terrorized by him, right? Like, yeah. I mean, you're not meant to see it that way, but I think in modern age, you would look at it and think, like, if she's really the reincarnated version of, I think her name's Caroline, the original person who was dating Candyman. I can't remember his original name.
Dating Candyman.
Dating, aka her name's
so
Zeba.
Lucky. Oh my god.
So I think if you're watching it in this day and age and you're kind of thinking, okay, well, good, she kind of deserves to be haunted by him. Not to like feed into she asked for it narrative, but she certainly injected herself into this myth which she had no business being in the first place. So she invited this spirit in. She said his name 5 times. Like, she welcomed it, and then, so it's kind of like that challenges your arrogance of this myth, which is where he has which is the only locus of his power right now at this point. And B, it's kind of like belated retribution for his disproportionate and extreme brutal punishment for their relationship that, like you said, Ty, and Zeba, was ultimately her fault.
There's also that point in the film when Helen is, and I think this is like the whole issue, it kind of representative of like the failings of the film. She mentions to Bernadette, she's like, it's only when a white woman gets hurt that the police take notice. And she's like, there's like one line of dialogue, but that's it in the film. They don't develop it further. I feel like in so many films they think just speaking it in one line is like enough. Like, that's enough for today type energy.
The throwaway woke line, and then back to our problematic.
It felt so awkward when she said it. And like Bernadette didn't, it's not like Bernadette had anything to say about it.
Bernadette is also problematic. Light-skinned, I'm so afraid of the hood, like almost validating her fear because she's light-skinned. So it's like, see, even she's afraid. So these projects, untouchable. And I was just like, just big sigh.
You know what I kind of read the union as, and with the baby? It was kind of like a Mary Joseph Jesus type thing.
Explain, Catholic gal. I'm not touching that. What?
This is purely from like dipping into the whole like sainthood thing, the idea of myth, and then the baby, which was fucking random. Unless it's just a baby to conjure up some sort of sympathies, which everyone cares about babies.
Hey, I like babies.
Okay, you like babies, but like it's not. It's just a cheap thing to use in a film. They care for the baby. It was a cute baby. Fair.
But they do. America loves babies. That's what Amy Dune says in Gone Girl. That's why she pretends to be pregnant. They love babies.
Because Helen does say, she's like, oh yeah, I want children when playing with that baby. Yeah, she made a point of it.
Well, I think the black baby there has another problematic function of, again, just much in the same way that Bernadette is like the excuse for their prejudice about going into the products. The black baby is kind of like the excuse for her actions, basically. It's like, no, she's okay because she's saving a black child. So obviously we have to stand.
That is what kind of like martyrs her, because then all of her the residents of the project come to her funeral. Yeah. It's like some weird initiation. It's like, oh, we accept her now. It's like, what? She exploited you guys and summoned Candyman back to the projects. Like, okay, but sure. But what were you saying about, what's this Catholic... It's not, I mean, not exclusively Catholic, but I don't know why. And maybe it was just like, I think it's they hammer it home about this idea of myth in the film, and he's always talking about this congregation, Candyman.
That's true. He does in his he is kind of like elevating himself to a saint-like figure in his echoing of like, when he's like advertising why she should join him, he's like, it's powerful and you get to be a myth and you get to blah blah blah, you know.
And he says we should make a new miracle. This is what I think that's all that together kind of led me to that.
Right.
I don't think it's like it doesn't come too strongly. I think it's more like, hey, if you want to go nuts and like read into this too deeply, then here's the type thing.
Which we do.
Also, the whole idea of like the Bible as like that's OG narrative in America, and especially in terms of like hijacking a sort of like Jesus is fucking Middle Eastern, let's make him white. There's so much to read into there.
I totally missed what you said because it sounded like a lot of profanity, and I know it was not.
I don't know. I don't want to talk about this point anymore because I don't think it's not fleshed out.
The fact that Candyman is meant to be the predator, especially when he slides his hook up her skirt, was extra insulting when we have a whole ass predator right there in the form of her husband or husband, who's like literally hooking up with his like 20-year-old students. I was like, and Candyman's the predator? I was livid.
I was livid. Because like it does. I mean, maybe this is just like, let's bulk out the character a bit. Why? What? Who gives a shit about Trevor? Why is he a character? Why is he cheating? Why is he with this student?
Child. Well, probably graduate, but still.
Helen.
What's the matter, Trevor? Scared of something?
Speaking of, like, very terrible significant others, that really brings us to our next movie, Get Out, which is literally about having a terrible significant other and meeting her terrible family.
What a segue. Fuck.
Finally, we're ending with the 2017 film Get Out, directed by Jordan Peele. In this film, Chris, played by Daniel Kaluuya, decides to visit his white girlfriend's parents during a weekend getaway. Although the family seemed relatively normal at first, Chris slowly comes to realize the brutal extent of their racism.
The chores have become my sanctuary. Get out. Sorry, man.
Okay.
Get out! Yo!
So, Jordan Peele is an alum of Sarah Lawrence College, where I went. Actually, he never graduated, but he does give us the gift of all of his movies long before they come out. We get screenings, and they're super secret service agents who watch your every move to make sure you're not filming anything or tweeting during it, because we see them so far ahead of time that there aren't even trailers yet. So when I saw Get Out, nobody knew what it was about even a little bit. Like, we were going into it completely blind. We didn't know who was in it. We didn't know the premise. None of that. There had been no press for it yet. So I went to a what we call predominantly white institution, but obviously every single black kid on campus went to this early screening, all perhaps a couple dozen of us. So I watched it early. Everyone had these like very authentic reactions. I think like having seen the trailer or knowing the premise or reading reviews really changes your reaction to a movie. We all thought Jordan Peele would be there. He didn't show up. It's all right. Thank you for the gift, sir. And then when it finally came out in theaters and I really knew everything that was going to go on, I was like, I have to go see this in theaters, even though I've already seen it. I have to go pay for it. And I'm going to go specifically for people's reactions to it. And when I got in line, it was super sold out. There was a line out the theater, and I looked around and I was like, oh, this is an interesting group of a lot of interracial couples. Like a lot of people brought their white girlfriends to see this program. I, knowing everything from months before, was like, oh, I can't wait to watch people walk out of this. Like, it's gonna be so satisfying. And everyone, you know, they're sharing little popcorn, like, having their cute little moments. And I could tell a lot of them were like, yeah, baby, like, I'm gonna take you to, like, this next up-and-coming film. Obviously, the reactions were the same as the first time I saw it. But walking out of the theater, dead silence. Like, a lot of people did not speak. Or they were, like, really trying to laugh it off. But I was cackling, and I felt comfortable cackling because like I knew where the funny moments were. Obviously there are those like beautiful comedic beats that happen and things like that, and then I was like, now I have to see it at the Magic Johnson Theater in Harlem. So I got myself on the train I said the next weekend, and I was like, I need to see this with an all black audience. And it was completely different. Like, watching it for that third time with those three different audiences, like, I think the third time with the mostly black audience, I would call it a comedy more than a horror movie, because people were much more comfortable laughing at it, talking to the screen, having their, like, visceral reactions, and those sort of jump scare moments where you're genuinely scared, or people have those realizations like, oh, I know what's going on, because it was, like, the stereotype of black people talking in movies. I think that is so perfect for horror movies, especially in a theater, because you need that catharsis of letting it out, of, like, the don't go in there, the oh, she's being stupid, the I see what's going on. Like, I think those three experiences of watching that movie are, like, unmatched, dude.
That's
very
amazing
experience.
Yeah, I'm so speechless. I'm jealous. I hate you.
I hate you.
What that was like one big flex. No, I'm just kidding. Anyway, Mila, what's your mediocre in comparison Get Out story?
It's actually so fucking mediocre. I saw Daniel Kaluuya on the tube.
The other day, I went to the Sunken Place by accident. Not like, I don't mean the metaphorical sunken place where you are like entrapped by white racists. I mean the actual experience of being like inside your body. I was basically about to fall asleep, and you know when like you're on the cusp of becoming unconscious, but you're still like, I heard a noise and it like woke me out of that, but the process of waking up legit felt like I was sunk inside my body, like inside my brain, and like rising to fill up my brain again and like my eyeballs. It was the most horrible feeling.
Sink into the floor.
Wait.
Sink.
So what did you think of like Rose's character?
Love her. Queen.
Oh, Mila, this is not.
No.
Obviously, we
I can see her as Marnie from Girls the entire time.
Okay, but on the low though, I feel like Marnie from Girls would.
She would.
What do we? I read a review, and it's just a general review, but it was talking about Rose as a vagina dentata.
Oh.
Is that how you say it? You know, she has that scene where she's talking about how she bit the first boy she ever kissed, and then her whole thing is like a temptress seduction thing. And like, to be clear, I love that, like, how all of this is done and that she's the villain in the end. Like, all honestly great plot twist. It's just interesting that the monstrous feminine tropes are invoked there, like, present again. But yeah, obviously I hate her.
I question her as a seductress because I'm like, she didn't really do anything seductive. I feel like almost people were just too trusting of her. Like, she really didn't do anything except for being like, I'm liberal and I bought you some breakfast, boo. Like, we didn't really see her go out of her way to seemingly be any more appealing. Like, it just seemed as though these people were falling into her web of, like, blindly trusting someone who appeared to be, like, an ally. And
I mean, no tea, no shade, but white women don't have to do much to get a nigga.
they don't.
Like,
I was like really trying to dance around that and be like, I mean, they don't have to do much to get black men to get them.
Maybe that's the point.
But I think that's the point. Yeah. I was thinking about the sunken place and like what that means and how it's presented, and I thought it was interesting that it's presented as if you're watching a TV, and then when he's being hypnotized, Missy Armitage is like reminding him of the passivity he did when it not led to, but like his passivity when he did not pick up the phone that could have saved his mother's life potentially if she didn't die on impact. So I was thinking about like that kind of passivity and why it would be a TV. And like besides the obvious like spectator thing, it was kind of like, what does a TV symbolize? Like, I was like, I think it kind of symbolizes that moment of like capitalism or like consumerist wealth being brought into the home. So maybe like this might be a bit of a reach, but black men who like passively consume this like assimilation tool, such as maybe dating a white woman, is what kind of leads him into the sunken place. Obviously, I'm not trying to blame his character, but I'm just saying I'm picking up on that notion of passivity and like, you know, how he just like goes unquestioningly into this relationship. Y'all get what I'm saying?
No, yeah, I've totally read something about this, that the life he lives with Rose, like in their really nice fucking millennial apartment, and also his like the fact that he's a photographer, which is just like hugely overrun by white men. There is like a sense that he's living that
a privileged
sort of
life, right?
Yeah.
Like a desire for an integration with like that kind of wealth, and in the very fact that he's even going to visit this antebellum style house kind of thing.
It's interesting because, like, when you contrast, like, why Chris was in the sunken place versus Lakeith Stanfield, whose name I don't remember, like, he has, like, a violent abduction, and he at no point wanted any part of that lifestyle. But Chris, like, goes into the house, and he's pretty chill with her family, and even though they seem like red flags all over from the beginning, he like completely blocks it out. Even like up until when he knows her parents are trying to kill him or do something to him, he's like, Rose, go get the keys, and he does not even comprehend that she could be a bad person.
Well, that's fair. Like, they had that quite strong emotional connection. Like,
but he had found all those pictures she had, even with like the gardener and the maid, and he knew that they also knew her. And they acted strange. So he had found all these photos, and he was still unable to conceive the notion that Rose was the villain. I am not projecting this onto all relationships by far, because I know people have healthy interracial relationships. But I have friends who are like gong-ho, very woke trademark, and they will date guys who are white, who are extremely problematic, and be like, I know that this person is so redeemable, you cannot convince me that they are a villain. And I'm like, but it's so clear. And like, I feel like Chris has the same relationship to Rose. Like, even when it's blatantly clear that she's not the one for him and her family are villains, she's been doing something sketchy, he's unable to conceive of this person that he's romantically attracted to is also rooted in white supremacy. And I feel like that's kind of hard for some people to conceptualize.
There's some sort of like lack of instinct for self-preservation, I think, that a lot of like Black folks have, of like, I don't feel this way about people, so I can't imagine that people genuinely feel that way about me, because like all the Black folks in this movie are being actively hunted, and yet even as an audience member you do a lot of like backbending and like mental flips to try and humanize them, whereas like they aren't interested in humanizing the Black folks at all. They're literally interested in using them for their bodies, point blank, period. And she's been in a whole entire relationship with every single person that they've kidnapped, and at no point had any moment of like switch or empathy. And so the fact that you could like look at her in those final moments and think, or even that he could look at her in those final moments and think, this is not an act of self-defense, that he views himself in that moment as a killer and not as somebody defending himself.
One critic reviewed it and was like, it maybe, not critic, but one person was talking about it and they were like, it maybe would have been too much if he had killed her. Like, it would have, for some people who would see it, it would have flipped the script too much, and then he wouldn't have been like as much of a sympathetic character, which I think is, for the record, bullshit, but because he'd be completely justified. But like, maybe it was like, I don't know, because choking someone's a really intimate thing to do, a really intimate death, right? So maybe it's like a very literally hands-on, very up close and personal.
No, like the way he kills everybody else, like when he like rams them with the antlers or fucking like it's very un-horror movie. Like, usually the victim is so helpless that if the villain dies, it's almost by accident. But, like, he actively kills people. And that is something I have never seen in a horror movie. It was so cathartic to watch, especially in a theater, because, like, you can cheer him on. And you don't even get that chance of, like, feeling bad for people, especially when you watch it alone. I think that was, like, very unique ending, because you expect everything to go wrong. And if what is his name, Chris, if Chris was a final girl, he would not have been able to like impale folks to get his freedom.
But then there's the alternative ending where he's like in prison, and his friend is visiting him being like, I'm gonna get you out, like we're gonna try to get this settled.
That would have been the worst ending in the world.
I'm glad it was the ending that it was. Yeah,
it would have been, if he had been arrested, it would have basically just been a repeat. It would basically have just been a repeat of like the 1968 Night of the Living Dead film, where the main protagonist, Ben, is the final man, just to be shot by the police. And I think, like, while that is the reality of the America we live in, certainly, I think much in the same way we have that kill your gays trope in, like, queer cinema, where we can't imagine, like, a happy ending for queer couples or queer people, and people had to start writing happy endings into existence, even if it wasn't the reality. I think in the same way we have to do that for Black cinema, because it's like, maybe that's not what would have happened, and we know that, but it's the satisfying ending, and it's the ending that we need to start imagining for ourselves, because you can't just see yourself die all the time on screen. Like, there has to be some sort of empowering representation there.
And I think it's enough that the audience has that moment of when we look over and we see there's a cop car. We have that moment already where we know how it could have gone. And I think that's enough of a switch in our brain that it didn't need to happen. Like, we know white women can weaponize the police. They call them, they scream, you know?
I knew that he was in jail in the alternate ending. I was like very not here for that ending, because it just felt too unjust considering what he had already been through. But also, like, the only thing that annoys me about the ending is that we don't get like a definitive yes that everyone who's already in the sunken place is like going to return to their normal state.
Maybe that's the more like cynical ending that Chris is sort of relieved of. Chris escapes and he's granted that happy ending, but you're still left with that like mourning for not just those characters, but like metaphorically everyone within the sunken place.
Well, you're left with like a legacy of slavery, basically.
Yeah.
Because they're still not free, so I still think it's somewhat revolutionary to have the main protagonist be able to escape. And then you do see, like, obviously the maid dies and then the other guy kills himself. I mean, it's not a great ending, but they're relieved. Like, I don't think they would have be able to be saved anyway because they had a lobotomy and stuff. So I think it would be like, you're too far gone.
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering.
Yeah, I don't think they'd be able to get out. Did you know, though? Okay, so I Googled, fun factoid. I Googled the meaning of Armitage, their last name, because I was like, I wonder. And it means hermit, and I just thought that's really ironic, seeing as the whole, like, a last name that means stuck in the house, and then the whole plot of the movie is get out of the house.
Wait, I thought you were going to make the connection of, like, a hermit crab, and, like, he's in somebody else's body.
Yeah. Oh my god, you guys. I didn't even think of that. Holy hell.
I'm so sorry for shitting on your factoid.
You didn't shit on it, you both enhanced it, and you made it better. Honestly, that's an obvious miss.
There's so many of those like subtle moments though that are like nods to history, nods to like language, the buck, the deer, the Olympic runner, the picking cotton, like all of those things are like things you don't catch on a first watch.
That's another
really
thing. It's like a horror movie, which I think more so than others demands a rewatch. Do you know what I mean? Like you said, there's so many layers to it. Like I didn't even realize his whole stuffing the cotton from the chair into his ears as a means of escaping until I watched it again. It's just like so masterful.
I think something that gets super overlooked about like people, like especially white people who like this movie is like, what don't you understand that this is about that this is about you, that like the myth of the good white person or the myth of the white liberal are exactly the people who are saying, I love Jordan Peele, I loved this film. Like, okay, I feel like a lot of white people watched this movie and thought because they noticed all those little hints that they watched it with a critical eye, but a critical eye when watching a film like this is to be like self-reflective. And I don't think a lot of people were self-reflective because even though they're, by the end, the family are like horrific, violent villains, what's really insidious about them is their ability to fake it, or those like little moments that got memed the hell out of, like the dad. I don't even remember what the original line is because it's been memed to death, but like, if I could vote for Obama twice, I would, or like Green Book was my favorite like film, or like all those little like I'm a good white person lines are things that I heard black people laugh at in the theater and white people miss entirely.
Do you think that's interesting? Because like now that people are trying to be anti-racist, there's so many people who want the conversation around being anti-racist to be very comfortable and not a experience where they look at themselves and see like, oh my God, I've done so many racist things in my life. I can't believe I've done this. I need to be reflective. I need to do better. It's more of like, well, I didn't call anyone the N-word and I don't sing along to rap songs and I give money to black people on the street. It's like a lot of like trying to make yourself feel better and not being able to be reflective, like people wanting ally cookies rather than like wanting to sit back and like honestly understand.
I think one of the really tough points that I don't hear talked about at all is that even if you yourself are anti-racist and you're dating a black person, if it is violent to bring them around your racist family. It is. Like if you haven't done that work in your own community, in your own circles, it's not enough for you personally to be anti-racist. And I don't necessarily believe that everybody is who thinks that they are. But like don't enter a relationship like that if you yourself cannot conceive of the violence you're enacting or aren't willing to like have those conversations. Because even early on in the movie, she would make like little jokes about like, oh, we're going to the middle of nowhere, or like, oh, we're pulled on the side of the road and you're with a white woman. Like, it's not enough that you know that that's dangerous. Like, you actually have to be able to protect your partner from situations like that. And I don't think a lot of people do that work.
But do you think, like, metaphorically, like, Jordan Peele's calling that out? Because in the end, she turns up to be the absolute, potentially worst character. So he's like, your white liberalism is completely performative, and it could very easily be flipped. I mean, obviously not to this extreme, but it can very easily be flipped to a very racist narrative. Also, I think it's very good in general, like showing the microaggressions and like how things that are supposed to be complimentary are actually just really alienating. Like that whole party where they're like, what's it like having sex with is it different? Is it different? Is it better having sex with a black man or something like that? And it's just like, those are microaggressions that happen every day that people don't realize are also alienating, even if you mean it as a complimentary, like it's objectifying.
Back to what Zayden was saying about, like, the act of violence of, like, bringing people into a situation when you know your family is racist. How many times have you, like, actually heard, like, a friend be like, I am so liberal, like, I came to college and got radicalized, but my family, or, like, my granddad is so racist. Like, nearly every white friend that I made in college told me that story, and I was like, how is your family racist? Like, when my family would say homophobic stuff when I was a kid, I would literally call them out at like 12. When they would say like homophobic stuff to my cousins and stuff, I would immediately call them out, and I was a kid. So I'm like, you as an adult being unable to call out your racist parents just does not make sense to me. Like, it's very hard to conceptualize. They love, like, that narrative where people are like, when the old generation dies out, we'll live in harmony. And I'm like, as if we do not see 13-year-old girls pretending to be black on TikTok and doing racist stuff. This is not an older generation thing. This is, like, a continuous thing that has happened. Like, white supremacy is not just with the boomers. It is very much in our generation. And I have no idea why people have such a disconnect where they're like, there's no way that I am racist. Like, as soon as my grandparents die, we will live in racial harmony. And we will be, like, holding hands singing Kumbaya. I'm like, that is not true. Have you missed the demographic of people at Trump's rallies? Like, it's not just people who are old and decrepit. It's, like, young people, too. This is not an old thing.
I was gonna say I read in an essay called Stay Woke by Kimberly Nichelle Brown. She was talking about it kind of relates to that the microaggressions and that objectification, because she was saying, like, here we have a very, like, we have, like, a battle over, like, the male gaze, which is interesting when it comes to horror, because usually you'd expect the man or the male protagonist to be a perpetrator, or the cameraman to be a perpetrator of the male gaze. But actually, in this case, he's a photographer, and the male gaze actually falls down when we're talking about black men to some degree, because historically black men have been the victim of a male gaze, which in the form of a slave auctioneer. So his choice of profession as a photographer, this critic was sort of saying, is symbolic, because it's like trying to reclaim the whole thing, is like trying to reclaim that sort of objectification, trying to avoid being the object and be in control of your own body, essentially.
That I didn't think about, like, when I said at the beginning, I think I was saying, like, how obvious all the stuff that her family did was to the audience. But I'm, like, thinking about in daily life how many microaggressions that you experience, and it doesn't necessarily red flag you as, like, this person is going to try to hypnotize me and to take my bodily organs. And I think maybe that is, in a sense, meant to make him, although, like, to the audience, you're like, how is he ignoring this stuff? Like, we ignore so many microaggressions in our daily life that it kind of desensitizes you to, like, the blatantly racist microaggressions that happen even when they do occur. Like, sometimes you don't even catch it until you think back on the incident, like, a few days later, and you're like, oh my god, like, I should have read that person for filth. Like, so when Chris is in the situation, I can see how, in the heat of him wanting to impress his, like, girlfriend's family and them putting on this guise of, like, white liberals, he would be able to dismiss this as, like, microaggressions that he's just rolling off, like, repeatedly until it gets to the point where he realizes it is true violence.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's, like, I think Daniel Kaluuya does a really good job of that, like, of, in the beginning, almost, like, laughing them off as a survival technique. Like, it turns into, when he discovers their racism or their performative allyship, it turns into him being like the classic "I told you so" couple argument, and it's just kind of like we kind of went on a rant of his passivity, but actually you could say, you know, that kind of passivity is something that's drilled into black people, because otherwise you're gonna have to have an argument every 5 minutes. You know what I mean? Like, so I'm not trying to say he's, like, should be blamed for that kind of passivity necessarily, because it is, you're right, it is something that's just so prevalent every day
It's also like, who does society allow to be angry? Like in these instances where Chris maybe does want to like really tell her parents off or really be extremely angry, he's not really permitted that space, because I feel like in society, Black people are not really permitted anger in the same way that white people are, without people immediately perceiving threat. Versus we see her parents do so many things that are threatening, that are just blatantly perceived as like normal. This isn't a big deal at all, because violence and anger are almost exclusively permitted to white people in public space.
But I guess that's why you're so, like, the ending is so cathartic, because it's finally like, yes, we can be so pissed and you can just straight up slaughter them, like impale them with the buck. Like it's so, because it's like all pent up throughout the whole film. You've been increasingly, as an audience member, depending on, I guess, your ethnicity or whatever, or your level of woke, you've been accumulating this like rage. So it's kind of like a nice release when he finally had it.
And I think that the sunken place as a concept represents when you've reached a point of passiveness that you can't even access the rage anymore. Like, you don't notice the microaggressions, or you've internalized things so deeply that or you're not in a safe place to express that rage. Like, the act of hypnosis or whatever, I think is, even though it happens in a matter of seconds or minutes in the film, I think is a process of like years of internalized depression, or years of passivity as a survival mechanism.
I, like, with Chris killing Rose's family in the ending, I almost feel, I don't know, I feel this way about a lot of horror movies actually, but in this one in particular, I don't know if I feel like him killing her family out of defense is even like a satisfying thing, because it's like the accountability in a way is still erased. And this is like in slasher films as well, when you have to kill the person inflicting horror or pain upon you out of defense, they're not really held accountable, and you have to carry all the trauma of having to end their life. I'm like, they're not held responsible in the eyes of justice. All the other people who they kidnapped, if he said that they were hypnotizing people and keeping them as slaves, like, how many people would believe that story, versus if they were actually held accountable and were forced to confess to doing these acts and put in prison. I am not a huge fan of prison, but like in this scenario, I'm like, they're not held accountable and like imprisoned in their own thoughts and held responsible. They're giving like almost a mercy, because he's forced to do it, and he's not a violent person, and we see how like kind and like passive he is throughout the thing. He's an artist, like he doesn't want to go around killing people, that he has to have that burden of killing them, otherwise they're just going to go on doing the same thing, and maybe he'll get away, or maybe they'll come after him.
I think you're totally right in the real world, but maybe that's what the sort of diegetic world and what films grant us is the ability for characters to do these, like, although it was literal violence, maybe more symbolic violence, we don't know, the film ended, but maybe they are then saved from like the trauma of it.
But I feel like he was affected by killing them because he couldn't kill Rose.
Yeah.
So he definitely felt something as he was killing them, even if it was anger, because like he couldn't go through with killing her because of like the emotions attached. So he definitely was feeling stuff in the moment, and it was very hard for him to perform these acts. And this isn't taken away from Jordan Peele's artistry at all, because I think that was necessary in the movie. But it kind of goes to like how things are in the real world as well, in which we don't often see justice in the traditional sense of like being carried through the courts with the police coming and arresting the person, listening to your side of the story, believing you. It's often happened to be carried out in an act of defense, and then you're just hoping for the best.
I guess that's because like the traditional route of justice is like rigged. It's not really serving Black people. So maybe that's why they have, like, all films have to imagine, like, this, which it goes back to what you said about, like, imagining a happy ending. Maybe that's what these films are sort of, that's, like, the next step, is that actually we imagine a future in which justice is served in that more, like, traditional sense. Maybe that is what's next.
I guess I hadn't thought about that contradiction, because I was looking at them as figures of, like metaphor. Each family member is a metaphor for a specific type of racism that's enacted. Like if Rose is a sort of fetishizing then her dad is a sort of white liberal, and then her brother is the actual, like, not actual, but like more violent face of racism, you know? So I kind of was like, yes, die, because, you know, it's like symbolic, it's a symbolic defeat, but I didn't really think about the level of like then who's accountable. I guess maybe perhaps Rose, because you don't know for sure if she does die. I mean, she's left bleeding in the street, but you never see her die. And that's my kind of
that's a
rule
clue
of any
for any
crime.
horror movie.
Yeah, any horror, any crime, if you don't see them guts spilling out, and even sometimes then they're not really dead.
But then there's also like the chance that she could get up, patch herself up from said incident, and then go on living her life doing the exact same thing that she was already doing. So that's what I'm saying, like the sense of like true justice, where you're like, yes, like you get it in Halloween and prom night, you get this sense of true justice where the killer is arrested and you're like, oh, they never have to bear that burden of knowing this person is coming after them. But he doesn't get that.
I guess the limitation of that is buried in the very title of the movie, which is the only aim is to get out. It's not to serve justice. You know, like the movie's not called Justice. Like all we can accomplish is actually the bare minimum. You know what I mean?
I love that. The movie's not called Justice.
No, that sounded like kind of, no, that sounded snarky. I didn't mean it like that. I just meant like, you know, it's the fact that you can the only form of empowerment is like the bare minimum, which is just escaping. Like that's the only goal. So it's the fact that it's like there's no imagination beyond actually serving justice, and yeah, it's impossible as of yet.
So essentially the only thing that he can get out with is like literally his life. That's the only thing that he gets out with. He can't save anyone else or anything, which I think is like the point of the movie, like you're saying, is like the bare minimum that we're lucky to get out with is our life. And in other situations, you just end up like everyone else. So I get what you mean. I just would have loved for there to be true justice in the film, because it kind of sucks that we can imagine her getting out from this incident, going to literally anywhere, and no one asking why she has these injuries, and immediately treating her, and her being able to go right back to the same antics. Like, that's not a far-off thing to imagine happening.
Maybe we should write to Jordan Peele and say, we want a sequel. We want a sequel where Rose goes off and tries to do it again, and then she's held the fuck accountable.
I feel like a sequel would be great, where we're in the current political climate that we are in now, and there is this more skepticism to, is this person racist, or are they white liberal, not racist, in quotation marks, and more people are willing to question her in a way where we see Rose being like her same self. She's woken up from a coma after her injuries. She tries to get up to her antics, and then she's put in her place properly and goes to jail.
But then it goes back to like how to imagine justice. I guess that would have to be another thing where we write in a more positive ending to the justice system, because then again you're relying on prison. Like you'd have to, she'd be like, in real America, she'd be able to just buy her way out and like get an attorney and get off, you know?
Because I'm like, in this scenario that we've really, that I've put into the universe where she survives this, at this point she would literally inherit all of her parents' money, so she would have a bottomless pit of money to do whatever she wants. This is truly just turned into a bigger nightmare than the first one.
I have a friend who, instead of like, you know, people are like, go to jail, or like, I'm calling the cops, she started saying, send them to the Restorative Justice Tribunal. Just like, imagine a different scenario where it's like a panel of fucking like Maxine Waters and Judge Judy, and you have to like face the consequences of like the community's whatever they decide is the retribution you deserve. But that, I think, yeah, a sequel would have to be an alternate universe, dude. Like, it's not the one that we're in.
This is so, like, not funny, haha, but funny, like, how we literally cannot conceptualize a world where true accountability is being served. Like, that's insane that we've hit this, not insane, it's completely believable, but we've completely hit a brick wall here.
Yeah, because we are all in agreement that Rose was somehow recover from this and literally not be held accountable in any way and go back to her same lifestyle. But also, I definitely agree with what Zane's saying about jail and prison. I'm definitely not the hugest fan, but also, like, I don't even know what punishment would fit Rose in this situation. I don't know what I would give her. I don't know. They have, like, Scandinavian prisons are, like, very functional. I think, like, the max sentence you can get is, like, 10 years. And you get bunnies and stuff and, like, learn how to be a better person. But also, that is assuming that we think Rose has the capability to reach humanity.
No. She's done. She's gone. Maybe that's why they have to die.
Yeah. Have you seen the way she eats cereal? She deserves to be choked out.
Yeah. Can we talk about it? I was the most, like, just jarring seeing her. It's like the smile at the end. It's like another uncanny. I'm like, ugh. And also just like the biggest white signaler. I don't know why. It was just really funny. Sorry, Mila. # sorry, Mila.
It's the first time we said it this episode.
Oh yeah, we haven't, it was...
I'd love to hear it more, that'd be great.
Every time a white person gets slated, it's # sorry, Mila. What do you guys make of the use of a phone flash being something that frees you from the sunken place?
I'm thinking, like, in the way that technology is so accessible to people now, it can take you to places all over the world and you can become more socially aware in the way that you weren't able to in the past. And the phone is like a link to technology. And so it can bring you out of ignorance or oppression. But I feel like that's a colossal reach that I just made up.
No, I think it's useful. Like, if the problem of the sunken place is that you're literally stuck inside yourself, then a phone being able to show you beyond your doorstep is really important, right? But also, like, you know, if the TV is what is the passive sort of thing, then the phone is a very active medium in comparison. So we have a transition from passivity to activity, or action, rather. And the whole thing of, like, the phone being a way of getting evidence, like when he takes a picture of the victim, that's how he's able to connect that this has been happening, aligns with, like, the BLM movement and how we need to record and document the terrible things that are happening in America in order to raise awareness, which I have problems with watching those videos anyway, but you know what I mean? So it's certainly seems to be like a very apt medium to choose.
Yeah, also in the way that, like, media on a television is controlled in the way that it's fed to you, because someone else is curating what clips they show versus what you choose to look on your cell phone is your complete choice. And if you choose to find a news network distrustworthy, you can not read news from them. Versus on the TV, you can't really go away from it. You can change the channel, but everything is still going to have the same angle in a way that something on social media or something posted on YouTube may not have.
I guess it's about, like, that open sort of ended form of creation, open sort of internet rather than closed encoded messages of TV.
Well, thanks, guys. That was such a great conversation. Thank you all for listening to The Monstrous Feminine. Be sure to follow us on Instagram and SoundCloud at The Monstrous Feminine Podcast and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Please leave us lots of comments. We'd love to hear what you think. Brooms up, witches out.